Hello again. This is the final of the 4 videos for the week, and this is on apartheid. What is apartheid? It is a South African policy of racial segregation. Apartheid meaning apartness, separation. So, what does that mean in practice? Well, let's take a look. As soon as I can get my PowerPoint to work here. There we go. Okay. Once again, a bit of a chronology. We have the mineral revolutions, diamond and gold discoveries in the late 19th century. Then the Union of South Africa by 1910. That ushers in a era of increasing segregation, as noted by certain legislation, Mine Color Bar, Natives Land Act, and so on. Then we see World War II, once again, also mentioned in the Makume article. And that is also going to have an impact on South Africa politically. Now, by that time, South African elections are only among whites. So it's an election primarily between the Afrikaners, whites of Dutch descent, and whites of British descent. And the whites of Dutch descent are largely poorer whites who felt well, they weren't happy about World War II to start with because they wanted to be on the German side, and instead South Africa joins on the British side. But the National Party, as we saw in the previous lecture, that was founded in 1914, becomes the voice for this sort of disaffected Afrikaner electorate, who are also, frankly, increasingly racist and kind of white supremacist throughout the 20th century here. And in 1948, there's a nationwide election, once again only among whites. And the National Party runs on the platform of apartheid, saying if they're elected, they're going to introduce this nationwide system of racial segregation. And they're elected, and that's what they do. And it really is an issue, I think, of the Afrikaners. Now, listen, the English speaking population isn't blameless in this situation. But if you take a look, this is the result of a poll among Afrikaners and English-speaking South Africans from 1977 about how they felt about certain things, racial policies in the country. And starts with, okay, would you agree to the admission of blacks to the same jobs as whites? Okay. English-speaking population says 85% say yes, that's okay. Afrikaners, 62%. Okay, how about equal salaries for whites and blacks? About the same. English speakers say 83% say that would be fine. Afrikaners, 62%. How about blacks and whites together on sporting teams? English speakers, 92% say sure. Afrikaners is 61%. Sporting facilities, here we go. Worshiping in the same churches. English speakers, 88% say yes, we should allow blacks and whites to worship together. Among the Afrikaners, it's only 32%. All right. So as you go down this list here, and you can read this at your leisure here, but the fact is that in every category, every issue, Afrikaners are frankly more what do I say? More racist, more white supremacist, more segregationist than the English-speaking population. You know, this might be something akin to if you had a similar poll, from the early 1950s between people in Alabama and people in New York, right? The fact is, though, that none of these things are the English speakers saying 100%, right? They don't. You get down to the bottom, and only 53% of the English speakers want blacks to move into white residential areas, right? But it's once again much worse amongst the Afrikaner population. So the Afrikaners and once again in the Makume article, he refers to them as Boers sometimes. They are really the driving force behind apartheid. And once again, it's the Afrikaner political party, the National Party, that wins the election in 48 and introduces this system. Okay, so what was this system? Well, this was once again, a nationwide system of racial segregation that was founded on a certain number of laws. And once again, also this is growing out of the earlier period of racial segregation that we saw in the first the first 30 years of the 20th century here. Okay, but under apartheid, things are going to be different and much more extreme. First law, the Population Registration Act of 1950, classifies everybody by race. So everybody has to go to a local racial classification board who will determine your race. And then Group Areas Act specifies where each group can live. So this is apartness, this is segregation. So it's identifying people racially and then separating them within towns and separating them within areas of the country, as we'll see here in just a minute. Okay? Then it also includes a Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act and an Immorality Act to increase social segregation. So before, sex outside of marriage between whites and blacks was a crime. And now it's any sort of racial grouping, mixed race, Asian, anybody cannot have sex with people of a different race. And now it also outlaws, though, what are known as mixed marriages. So white people and black people can't marry one another either. So once again, similar laws you had in the U.S. South, right? You had in was it the Supreme Court case in Virginia? I think, wasn't it? The Loving couple in Virginia, and that was into the early 50s, I believe. Anyway, and then finally, the other main law of apartheid is the Bantu Education Act of 1953, which takes all schools out of the hands of religious or missionary organizations and gives control of them to the government. Okay, so they can control everything about education now. Okay, so the apartheid system then, as I said, is about racial classification and racial segregation. There are also secondary apartheid laws, many of which are kind of like the Jim Crow laws. The Motor Transport Act of 1930, which is amended in 1955, segregation on trains and buses, okay, like we see here. The Liquor Act of 1928, people of different groups could not be served in the same premises, okay? So, but once again, kind of like Jim Crow South, right? Certain restaurants aren't going to serve African Americans. Separate Amenities Act, benches, beaches, parks, et cetera, all set aside for one racial group or another. And as we saw in the U.S., separate is not equal, right? So you're going to have, of course, the best amenities set aside for the white population and much fewer and worse amenities for the other groups in society. Okay. So back to the Population Registration Act. The Population Registration Act actually designated 3 racial groups: the white population, black population, and the mixed race, or what's known in South Africa as the colored population. So whites were just one group, but these other groups were subdivided further. So among the colored category, for example, you had Cape Colored, Cape Malay, Griqua, Indian, Chinese, other Asiatic, other colored. So there's that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different subgroupings. And then among the black population, you had 9 different subgroupings. So why is this? I mean, it's a classic divide and rule. Because the fact is, the white population is the minority population. Early in the 20th century, they were about 20% of the population. But that's actually declining relative to especially the black population. and whites are heading toward about 10% of the population by the latter part of the 20th century. And, 10% of the population controlling 90% of the population is very difficult. So instead, the theory was to break down the colored and black groups into smaller subgroupings so they would be easier to control. Okay, so yeah, so it's kind of what I just said. Except for the black population, the grouping they're put into also determined what their homeland was. Because if you remember, the 1913 Native Land Act created African reservations. Well, under apartheid, they're going to actually add land to those reservations and create what they call, quote unquote, homelands. And the theory was this. The theory was that all black residents of South Africa were no longer actually residents of South Africa. They were residents of these independent homelands. And it was the goal of the South African government to spin these homelands off as independent places. So you would have a white South Africa, like you see on this map. All the white areas would be white, and all the other areas would be set aside for the African population, which once again is about 13% of the land now, with a little more land added to it. So it's still not going to hold the entire population. Nor, of course, could it really, because the white population needs African labor, right? They need Africans working in industry and jobs, in agriculture, in domestic service, in everything else. So, I mean, on one hand, the apartheid system is trying to set up this system of racial segregation, which it does. But at the same time, it acknowledges that the whites are reliant on the black population. So there's an inherent, discontinuity in there that tells you, okay, ultimately this is not going to work, right? I mean, that and the fact that once again you got 10% of the population trying to control 90%. Yeah, that's not going to end well. So the whole thing though is enforced with passbooks. Like this one gives your identity, what your ethnicity is, in this case Zulu, and it tells you where the homeland is, with KwaZulu-Natal and so on, whether you've paid your taxes, who your employer is, et cetera, et cetera. And everybody had to carry, all the black population anyway, and colored population had to carry these books around. And if you didn't have your passbook on you, it was, grab you up, 90 days in jail right then, boom. The white population, of course, was also required to have them, but if they didn't have them on them, they got 24 hours to show up to the police station with it. Another, just a small one in this case, but another indication of how the system is separate and unequal here. The only way really to enforce this system was through brute force. And you can kind of see that in the military and police spending here under the apartheid system. SAP is the South African police, and you see in 1961 there's 27,000 police in the South African police force. By 20 years later, it's up to 77,000. Why is that? African opposition to this. Starting off with peaceful protest and then moving to armed uprising and violent protest. Similarly, across the military, South African Defense Forces, 79,000 in 61. By 1981, over 500,000. Total armed forces, military spending, and this is in Rand, but it's relative. So it goes from 72 million Rand to as the Brits would say, 3,000 million Rand, right? Or we would say 3 billion. So this is also, frankly, another sign that this system is untenable in the long run. It's not sustainable to keep spending such a large percent of your government revenues in this kind of thing. So it's just not going to be sustainable in the long run, especially after the 1970s with the drop in gold prices. The U.S. goes off the gold standard and so on. Gold prices drop, and South Africa takes a real hit. Okay. Okay, what does the apartheid system mean? Well, okay, first, so as I said, there's African opposition to this. The ANC is founded in 1912, actually to battle the Natives Land Act, and then you have a series of different sort of protests and campaigns, civil disobedience, campaigns against Bantu education, calls for a non-racial democratic state, women's protests against past laws, Pan-African Congress founded, all of which, frankly, the government just kind of beats down and beats down more and more and more until 1960, when there's a pass law protest, which is met by gunfire by the government, and they kill 69 people in what's known as the Sharpeville massacre. And that's one reason why you have this huge increase after 1960 in the police force, because African protest. And after the Sharpeville massacre, Africans shifted away from peaceful protests, civil disobedience, and nonviolence and so on, and moved to violent and even military uprising against the system. This is something we'll see across the continent. Every settler colony, everyone is going to have a violent route toward independence because the white population just doesn't want to give up their privileges. Okay? They don't want to give up the land they've taken. They don't want to give up political privilege, the educational privileges, whatever else it might be. They don't want to compromise. Okay? If pictures of segregation laws, segregation signage, and so on. Europeans over here, non-Europeans over here, and so on. Why don't they want to give a privilege? Well, here's an example. Okay, let's look at apartheid and education spending. Among the white population, student-teacher ratios in schools, 18 pupils to 1 teacher. The Indian population, it's 24 to 1. Colored population is 27 to 1. African population, 43 to 1. Okay? It's just not as good an educational experience, and one teacher is trying to control 43 kids in a classroom, right? Okay. Same thing in healthcare. For the white population, there's 1 doctor for every 330 people. For the African population, there's 1 doctor for every 12,000. And that plays out in life expectancy. Life expectancy for the white population, 72 years. African population, 59. Okay? So the whites realize that to overthrow the apartheid system means giving up some of the advantages they have, and they really resist doing that. There's a message in there for other countries like ours as well, I think. Anyway, okay, so that's in a nutshell what the apartheid system is, and that's sort of the context or background for Nde Makume's life. All right, thank you very much.